Welcome to this, the fifth in the series of IAR Zoom events and the second to be held jointly with the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom. I'm pleased to say that around 150 people have registered for this event. I think that reflects the timely nature of the topic and looks like we have a good number of school representatives on the Zoom, so welcome. My name is Carolyn Jones. I am the Director of the Institute of Employment Rights, and I am proud to be chairing this evening's event. For those who don't know us, there will be details on how to follow, how to support, and how to join in the activities of both the Institute and the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom on our closing screen. I am very pleased to welcome an all-female panel this evening, and I am very comfortable in the knowledge that 3 out of the 4 originate from the North. So welcome to you all. At first glance tonight, the subject matter, education, health and psychological well-being, doesn't appear to be about employment rights and trade union freedoms, which are, of course, the core work of both the Institute and the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom. Except that looking after the health and well-being of teachers, support staff and parents is central to employment rights. And in terms of trade unions, in recent weeks, the role trade unions play in society, in the economy and in the protection and promotion of safe working conditions, not least in education, trade unions have shone like a beacon through the government's often incoherent public safety messages. And there is another link. How we treat the children of today, the COVID generation, will inevitably impact on the lives of workers in the future. We need to nurture and support the next generation to expect better, to understand equality and to recognise their worth in society. So IAR and CTUF are pleased to jointly present this discussion tonight, and we're more than pleased to be able to enjoy not just one, but 2 victories in these otherwise gloomy and turbulent times. Only today, the government were forced into a U-turn on its decision to remove food vouchers for 1.3 million kids who depend on free school meals. What a victory that was. And we'll hear later from Rebecca Long-Bailey on how that debate went in the House of Commons today. And of course, that victory comes on the back of another government U-turn, when the government was forced to reverse its reckless determination to open schools on the 1st of June. That was undoubtedly a victory for public safety, and it was certainly a victory secured by the teaching unions. The NEU's quick response, and remember, they only had a week to develop an effective campaign, was inspiring to watch. The NEU's recruitment, organising, election of workplace reps all helped to build a movement. And that movement gave local councils the confidence to say no to government. That shows what a movement on the move can do, and we salute their efforts. But the threat is not over. Yesterday, Britain went on a retail spree. The government has announced a review of the 2-metre distancing rule, and very soon pubs will reopen again. And yet over the weekend, Dr. Hans Kluge from the World Health Organization cautioned that the UK remain, and I quote, very active phase of the pandemic. The World Health Organization went on to say that England's coronavirus lockdown should not be further lifted until the government's contact tracing system had proven to be robust and effective. And I'm sure you'll all have your own opinion on whether we've reached that stage yet. And only today, China announced a second wave of COVID-19 and plans to lock down Beijing. So the threat level remains high. And tonight we have 3 excellent speakers to discuss those issues, to consider how and when our schools should reopen, and to look at how we can all best look after the well-being and new generation from this COVID chaos. So I'm very excited to welcome our first speaker. That is Dr. Mary Bousted. Mary is Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, and before that, Mary was General Secretary of the Association of Teachers and Lecturers Union, which amalgamated with the National Union of Teachers to form the NEU. So first, congratulations, Mary, and well done on your campaign. There's no doubt that the NEU led the pushback against the government plans to prematurely open schools. You've shown that it's possible to push for change and to win. Your 5 tests for when schools should reopen gained popular traction with parents, teachers and local authorities, all of who agreed with your reasonable demands. I've no doubt you have a new plan for education that will be similarly effective. So talk us through your campaign highlights, Mary, and your plans for the immediate future.
So thank you very much, everyone, and welcome. So I'm Mary Bousted. I'm Joint General Secretary with Kevin Courtney of the National Education Union. So we represent 450,000 members, teachers, lecturers, leaders and support staff working in schools and colleges throughout the nations. And the first thing to say is that when Boris Johnson stood up on the 10th of May and made his speech that 4-year groups would go back into primary schools, reception, year 1, year 6 and nursery children. We had no idea that he was going to make that announcement, and we were shocked that he would make what we thought was such a reckless and unsafe announcement about return to school. We had been, throughout when schools closed in March, our position was we wanted the government to be clear with us about the science, about what their modelling was based on in terms of the modelling of the disease, the modelling of the transmission of the disease, the vulnerability of children, the vulnerability of adults working with children, and the vulnerability of communities if schools reopened. So we wanted the government to tell us what the scientists were telling them based on their current knowledge. And we accepted that the knowledge was imperfect, that this was a new disease, that we didn't expect to have perfect answers, but tell us what you know at the moment. And our key question was, what does the science tell us on the current knowledge about the implications for our members and for the wider community if schools reopen? So that was in the early weeks of the pandemic. We wrote 4 letters to the government asking detailed questions about their modelling of the spread of the virus, and we got no response. So on the 5th of May, we published our own research report, which was a summary of the international evidence. Now, we're not scientists. Actually, Kevin, my Joint General Secretary, is a scientist, but we're not epidemiologists. We're not experts in disease, transmission and infection. But we were able to look at what the international evidence said about schools reopening, what the risks were, what the dangers were, what the possibilities were, and in particular, what was the effect of schools reopening on the rise of the R rate and about greater transmission of the virus. And so we called it the Coronas of Pupils and Schools Unanswered Questions. So our report looked at the transmissibility of the virus between children and staff in close quarters and government assumptions on that, the modelling of the spread of the virus in different scenarios of school opening, modelling of social distancing in schools. What were the government's learning from the science about what social distancing in schools should look like? What was the government's plans for testing and personal protective equipment? What was the effect on vulnerable staff, and what was the modelling, staff who were shielding but also staff who had other comorbidities? What was the effect of different schools' patterns of school reopening, because different countries were doing it in different ways? So what were they learning about different patterning of school reopening? What were their plans for contact testing and tracing, and how long would it take for a system to be in place that really worked? And the key question is, what was the government's evidence on the transmission between children and other children, and between children and adults? And that was obviously the key question, both for school staff and for communities, particularly Black communities, where living in multi-generational households, given what we now know about the greater susceptibility to death or to severe illness from certain ethnic minority communities, what does the government's modelling on that? And as you said, we set 5 tests for a safe return to school, which were a much lower number of COVID-19 cases, a national plan for social distancing in schools, testing, a whole school strategy, and protection of the vulnerable. And this last point, protection of the vulnerable and those who live with vulnerable people, has been key throughout our campaign. We've been absolutely clear that with children learning at home, the majority of children learning at home, there is plenty of work for vulnerable staff to do, for people who are anxious about returning to school to do, and plenty of work for those who are living with vulnerable relatives to do as well. Just recently, we've issued further guidance. We went on our website last week for vulnerable members and for Black members, including their rights, how they approach the employer about reasonable changes to their work, what we know from Fenton about Black staff about the same age, with the same comorbidities as white staff and white members, and their risk of death from COVID-19. And we've produced really very detailed guidance for members about the duty of the employer on the management of health and safety at work, their right to a safe and suitable environment where sufficient risk assessment is done, and that we're absolutely clear that ethnicity must be key to an employer's risk assessment. We have had massive traction from the membership during this campaign. 2 days after Boris Johnson made his announcement on the 10th of May, we did a Zoom call for primary members. We had over 20,000 primary members on the Zoom call. We've just done a Zoom call tonight for primary members. We've had over 3,000 on the Zoom call. So we're doing Zoom calls regularly, and our members are coming back and coming back and coming back. Tonight, the big question was around bubbles and social distancing, because the government's guidance on social distancing and social and cohort distancing isn't clear. We've telephoned 8,000 of our school reps to find out what's going on in their schools. That's a third of our rep base. We've had Zoom meetings with thousands of reps on it. Just last week, a Zoom meeting with 2,000 primary reps on that. We've had Zoom calls with supply teachers, with Black teachers, with early years teachers, with post-16, with school leaders, with supply staff. And so some unions have said to us in this pandemic, well, our democracies, we can't get hold of our members. We've used this pandemic as a new way of contacting members. We've got branch meeting in Tower Hamlets last week with 350 members on the Zoom call. So we now realise that as long as you've got, you can't do a Zoom call with minutes of the last meeting, matters arising, Treasurer's report, President's report. People will be reluctant to come to that as they are to go to those reports, those meetings in person. But if you've got a topic and it's of interest and you've got good speakers, then members will want to be on that Zoom call and they will want to engage. Throughout the campaign, we've now recruited more than 3,000 new school reps, and we have over 2,500 new, what we call them, checklist monitors. They don't want to be reps yet, but they're happy to go in and do the checklist. And in the future, we will be giving our reps lots of checklists, because we realise a checklist is a really powerful tool. Because what the checklist does is say to the rep or to the checklist monitor, I've got this checklist, it's from my union, it's about the guidance that the government's issued, and I want to come in and discuss it with you. And it gives a framework for that conversation. So in September, we'll be issuing a checklist for reps and checklist monitors about pay progression in school. What's your leader's pay progression policy? They surely haven't, have they, used the pandemic and used the fact you're working from home to deny you pay progression. So we are going to be using that. Just yesterday, Kevin, my co-joint general secretary, was on a Black Lives Matter call with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. We had over 6,500 members online. And from that, we had 850 members saying, yes, I'd like to be a rep. So we're using that to grow the union, to grow involvement in the union. And, I certainly, the profile of education, I find myself on the broadcast media much more, and I find representations for me in the right-wing press, which I don't recognise myself, but they've done us no harm. So if the Daily Mail's listening, I'd like them to thank them very much for being so nasty about me, because it's really helped. Just to finish with, the National Education Union launched last week its National Education Recovery Plan. It's been supported by Labour, by the Lib Dems and by the Greens. It has 10 points. So to quickly go through those, the first point is disadvantaged children and young people must be the key priority. They must not become casualties of COVID. Secondly, we've won this. Margaret Rashford, thank you. Free school meals throughout summer holidays. Labour, Rebecca leading that call and that petition of free school meals, backed up by Margaret Rashford, supported by the NEU. That's been achieved. What a marvellous achievement that is. Thirdly, we think the local authorities should be making a local summer holiday offer. It shouldn't be down to teachers and schools to run this. It should be local authorities should be funded to make an offer to allow deprived children, vulnerable children in particular, to give them something to do in the summer, mostly outdoors, healthful activities to get them confident, to get them out of their home, to get them interested in and connected again. 4 and 5 are really ambitious. Public buildings, such as libraries and sports halls and civic centres, should be used to expand the spaces available for schools in September, so that there isn't we have the smallest schools, the smallest classrooms in Europe, and we have the highest secondary pupil teacher ratios. So we can't assume that we can simply get all our pupils back into schools, into secondary schools. We think there's going to be too much pressure on the school site. So like the Scottish Government, we want the government to explore using public buildings to expand education space and to get supply teachers, qualified teachers who've left the profession, 22% leave after 2 years, and to get student teachers who are looking for a job back into working in these smaller class sizes, so that we can have more social distancing in schools and teaching more pupils. The government will say this costs a lot of money. I tell you now, it costs an awful lot of money if parents can't go back to work because there aren't school places available. And it will cost a lot of money if we have children not in school for months on end, because they will lose their confidence and their ability to learn. So if we can't fit them all into schools, we have to expand the school site, and we have to get many more teachers back into work. Supply teachers, qualified teachers, and get newly qualified teachers back into work to do this work to educate our pupils. GCSE and A-levels will have to be changed because pupils have lost so much of their time, and the primary school accountability measures will be changed. So just like the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, our government should be making plans for blended learning, learning at home and at school, because even with more school sites, it's likely that children will be at home more often. Crucially, children in poverty and in low-income households must have access to the internet. 700,000 children don't have access to the internet at home, and they must have access to online laptops so that they can do more learning from home. Teachers have been, criticised for not doing more online learning. 9 in every 30 children in every average class will be poor. Those children will not have access to laptops and be able to do online learning, so they need that. And finally, childhood inequality and poverty are the key determinants in education underachievement. So we know that for young children, by the time they start school, if they are poor and they are disadvantaged, 40% of the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their middle class peers is set in stone and cemented before they start school. And what we then say to schools is, ignore poverty, ignore low wages, ignore the hunger, ignore the poor clothing. Well, don't, because schools don't ignore it. But you do for those, you achieve for those children what you achieve for children who haven't had those disadvantages. If we really want to eradicate the education gap, we have to eradicate child poverty. And in order to do that, we need good work, we need decent work, and we need parents who are secure and in good employment. And finally, our plan says we need a national plan for children's well-being. Many of these children will have been through trauma, so we need to incorporate that into the curriculum. When we ask our members, when children come back into school, what do you want to do? Do you want to do catch up for an exam? Or do you want to get them involved in the school, back into society and supporting their well-being? 90% of our members say we want to do well-being, creativity, socialisation, and developing their social skills, their emotional skills, in order they can re-engage with learning and do much better. And societies which are doing well with COVID, that's what they're focusing on. So that's what the NESU is doing, and that's our 10-point plan, and that's my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Well done, Mary, and thanks for keeping for your time. That was, as I said at the beginning, inspiring. You said that you're not a scientist, but you are a professional working in the education sector, and it's just such a shame that the government weren't talking to you earlier to be able to learn from your knowledge of experience on life on the front line. So well done for that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We'll get round to them eventually, so thank you. I will move on though to our next speaker, so that I maintain the strict timetable too. Our next speaker is Professor Susan Michie. Sue is Professor of Health Psychology and Director of the Centre for Business Behaviour, Centre for Behaviour at the University College London. Sorry, Sue. Sue worked as a clinical psychologist for children and families for many years. She is on the government's COVID-19 Behavioural Advisory Group to SAGE, not SAGE, and on the Indendent SAGE Committee, an independent group of scientists providing advice to help navigate COVID-19 and minimise fatalities. But Sue tonight is speaking in a personal capacity. Sue, Indendent SAGE, it played an important part in securing the victory of the teaching unions. Your well-timed report, saying it was not safe to open schools on the 1st of June, carried an awful lot of weight. So before we get into how to look after the health and psychological well-being of kids remaining at home during the pandemic, tell me about Indendent SAGE and the work it does and what you'll be doing next. Sue.
Thanks, and thanks for involving me in this great discussion this evening. And Mary, fantastic to hear such a coherent, comprehensive strategy. You don't often hear that in this day and age from certain quarters, so really refreshing. Wonderful work. When I was asked to join Indendent SAGE, the reason I did was what it was trying to do, which was bring more of a public health angle to the discussion, which really hasn't got much of a voice on the government SAGE, but also brings some openness and transparency so that scientific thinking and evidence could be shared in a timely, open manner with everybody who wanted access to it. And at that time, SAGE wasn't publishing its members or its minutes or its papers or anything. And I think it's not seeing itself as a rival, it's seeing itself as complementary. And I've been really proud to be part of it. I think it's doing a really good job. So you mentioned the schools report, I'll talk to it now, but tomorrow is being launched a report on test, trace and isolate and what we think should be done about that. The reports try to be practical and accessible, but also scientifically based. And the report after that we've got lined up is going to look at equality, which is so key to all of these issues. The chapters in the report, just go through them quickly. There's one on transmission risk, one on education risk, one on infection control in schools and communities, one in how to plan for opening schools safely, and finally preserving education in the summer. So those are the headings. But it's obviously an incredibly complex issue because there's so many different things that need to be taken into account at the same time. And one of the things that we really thread through that report, and China's CAD with what you're saying and Mary's saying, is the children are really important. But in terms of the risk for COVID, they're not the group in themselves that are of so much concern. But it's the teachers and the support staff, and it's the households and communities that the children are going back into. And in primary schools, a third of children are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, which we know are at increased risk to both getting COVID, but also the negative effects of it. One of the things we really stressed was the importance of decisions being made at a local level. The government's lack of strategy, but just coming up with piecemeal guidance and proposals that haven't been discussed properly, negotiated with all the different groups that should be involved in that decision making, and doing it with very little time for planning or preparation is not a way for managing COVID. And doing it on a national or an English-wide basis anyway, without thinking about how does this apply to individual communities that are so different, just doesn't make sense. So we ask that, that when decisions are taken, it's been done on a local basis, taking into account the local outbreaks, the needs of staff, parents, what the governor's perceptions were, trade union input, etc. And the way that we work is that we put out a consultation document. So we put together our heads, get other experts relevant to the topic, draft something out, and then have an open consultation and listen to people who can get onto the hour and a half that we're on a Zoom call, but also through Twitter, through lots of other means, try and get feedback. And we did the schools one in collaboration both with Mumsnet to get their voices heard, and also the British Medical Journal. And I know Kevin Courtney was one of the main people lined up to be asking questions at the beginning. And then on the basis of that feedback, we then write the final report and recommendation. So that's how we've been doing it. We'll carry on doing it. I think it's a really good way of doing things. So you know, the local decision making, I think, was at the heart of what we were doing. And the schools report we did in a situation where, as Mary said, this call had gone out without any scientific evidence being published to draw on. Eventually, after we got going, they did publish what they'd done, but the scenarios they'd modelled were different ones than the one that the government had been asked to do. So what we tried to do is to directly address the actual real life context and people who are trying to make decisions. Other, just going through in no particular order, but some of the points that we made, and a lot of them reflect what Mary said, which is reassuring, was the importance of thinking about education in the broader sense, and the importance of the social and psychological well-being of children, and calling for summer camps and outdoor schools, you know, marquees in open grounds where there's much less risk of transmission. And we asked that, for example, over the summer, the playing fields and facilities of independent private schools could be used for this purpose. Obviously, there's staffing issues, but you know, there's a lot of groups of people who could be brought in to help with that sort of activity. We called on real-time local data to guide schools in their decision making. And one of the things that is a real problem is the fact that the government has dragged its heels so long on getting a test, trace and isolate system set up. You know, we knew back in February this was coming. The WHO had been all the time saying test, test and test. Why is it so important? It's so important because as you know, we come out of the more overall restrictions of lockdown, inevitably there are going to be outbreaks in particular schools, in particular workplaces. And unless you're testing, you don't know where those are. You can't test people to find out who's picked it up and get them to isolate. That way you can suppress it locally. Without that, you can't. You don't know what's happening, where it's spreading, and the whole thing will just take off again into a second wave. So we're in a very dangerous situation at the moment. You know, we're still alert level 4. 2 out of the 5 of the government's criteria haven't been met for lifting lockdown, given we haven't got the system in place. They tried with their app. We've not heard anything about it for a long time. I don't think it was successful. Why is it not being successful? Because it's being done at a national rather than local level, not in partnership with local government, local public health infrastructures, the primary care networks, all the people in the localities who know the communities, know the context, and are trusted by the local communities. But instead being, you know, outsourced, privatized to big private companies with people recruited, hardly trained at a national level. And so when people are contacted, you know, it won't be a trusted local figure. And the whole system absolutely depends on trust. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about that. That's our next report. But it all interacts because it's really important from the point of view of people working in organisations and schools to have this system in place to protect staff, the pupils, everybody. We also developed a risk assessment tool and encouraged people to use it on a case-by-case basis. We also, in the report, called for internet and tablets or laptops for all children because of this horrendous issue of increasing inequalities. You know, we're one of the most unequal countries in the world. And what happened as a response to COVID has meant that those inequalities have got even greater. Those on more precarious and low incomes, their situation has deteriorated, whilst those on higher incomes have been protected. People in poor housing conditions have had a really, really difficult time over these last few weeks. I could go on, but there's ways in which some of it was inevitable in the short term, but most of it isn't. It can all be restored, and indeed going forwards, there's obviously a whole issue about how we distribute our wealth across society and what kind of society we want. But on the issue about the internet, it did remind me of the outrage, public outrage, when the last team around Jeremy Corbyn suggested that all households should have access to the internet. You know, life has shown how sensible, important that call was. And many years ago, I went on a scientific trip to Uruguay, and there was a very socialist-minded president at that time. And when I was there, the last 6-year-old was presented with a tablet that was connected to the internet, because the policy was that every child 6 years and older would be given free internet access via a tablet, on the basis that you can't achieve equality without digital equality. And the final thing that I picked out in the report was calling for provision of midday meals and addressing the issue of children's hunger, because if children are hungry, then they're not going to learn, and they're not obviously going to be able to have the sort of well-being that we all want for children. We specifically modelled what would be the likelihood and the risk of transmission if schools went back on the 1st of June compared to a couple of weeks later, and also that if you delayed more, the risk would be lower, as a way of helping schools to make that decision. So I hope that gives you a sense of who we are, what we're trying to do. We're very open and always would value any input about what we could be doing, or any questions where we can help. We're a small group of 12 people. We all have really busy day jobs, but obviously completely committed to making the science. And when I say the science, there's not such a thing as the science. And also there's not such a thing as following the science. You know, policymakers, decision makers will take many things into account, and that includes scientific advice, but the government has to own the decisions it's made. It's not following the science, and so the science can't be blamed when things go wrong. And in terms of what science is, it includes, I'm a behavioural scientist, we have social scientists, we have public health scientists, we have virologists, we have statistical modelers. There's a huge range of different scientific approaches, because any one of the questions that we need to be thinking about requires the bringing together of very different kinds of scientific evidence and scientific thinking. But at the end of the day, the political decisions are political decisions and need to be owned as such. And I would just end with an observation about the 2 metre versus 1 metre rule. If I've got time, Cad, have I got a couple more minutes?
You're pushing it.
Right. Okay. Well, I can always come back.
Come back in a question. Yeah, of course. Thanks for that, Sue. Excellent as ever. And if it's okay, we'll put a link to your organisation at the end of the screen as well, with the rest of our information. So just to say to people, this is getting videoed. So if you don't catch it all, or if you want to share it, it will be up on our website within a week, I would say. So thank you, Sue. You talked about practical, accessible and scientific, just like you. Brilliant as ever. I really look forward to reading your report tomorrow. I'm sure it'll be just as influential on future developments and discussion as your previous one was. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move swiftly on to our final speaker, who I see has arrived in the room. I did say she might be late. Rebecca Long-Bailey has been an MP for Salford and Eccles since 2015. She is Shadow Secretary of State for Education since 2020. Before that, Becky was Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy under Jeremy Corbyn from 2017 to 2020. It was in that role that I worked closely with Becky on our proposals for a new framework of labour law, and it is fairly compulsory now for me to hold up our book on this issue so people can see it. And that framework place trade unions at the heart of the UK economy, giving them and workers a voice at work and a seat at the government table via a proposed Ministry of Employment Rights. So, We've seen all over the news how Marcus Rashford has hit the headlines, and what great support to have in terms of any campaign. I don't know whether I've got this right or wrong, Rebecca, but it was my understanding that it was you who launched that campaign in a Holidays Without Hunger petition that you started. So I don't think it was Marcus, great though it was. I think it came from Rebecca at the Labour Party had started that to make sure that the UK's 1.3 million kids don't go hungry over the summer. Rebecca joins us straight from the House of Commons, where she has been speaking and voting on the Opposition Day motion in relation to the free school meals. So, Rebecca, another government U-turn and another popular victory and an essential £15 a week going to hungry children. I have to say, Rebecca, all these government U-turns are making me dizzy. So can you give us an update on what happened in the Commons today and talk us through your current and future demands of this government? Becky.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry I was late coming in. I had to run back from the chamber there just at the end of the debate. And I know I've missed the beginning, and we've got some really brilliant speakers. I came in partway through Mary's speech, and Mary's always a force of nature. So she's covered a lot of the things that I wanted to say already. But in terms of what happened today, this is the second U-turn in 2 weeks, although we've been very quiet and understated about it. And obviously today, there are I wouldn't say that I was the one that kind of pushed this campaign, because there's so many people that have been campaigning on this issue for a very, very long time. But certainly within the party, we tried to organise a more coordinated campaign over the weekend, and had a little bit of help from Marcus Rashford, which was fantastic. And I've got no doubt that he has politicised people or made people aware of the issue in a way that, as great as I am, I wouldn't have been able to do by myself, and I'm sure the colleagues would say the same thing. And it's been fantastic to see what was achieved today, that the government was shamed into performing this U-turn at the 11th hour. And what it means is that children now who are eligible for school meals, they'll get a free school meal over the summer holidays, and they weren't going to get that. But it's only going to be for this summer. And it's really a temporary sticking plaster. Before we all get carried away with this small victory, we've got to look at the wider issue, and that's child poverty, because in reality there shouldn't be children on free school meals, because their families should be in an economic situation that's capable of providing for them all of the time, and that's not happening. And Mary might have already pointed out some of the statistics that we already know about, that 9 out of every 30 children in a class will be in poverty, and that's set to get far worse as this pandemic continues, because we know that we're almost certainly going to be facing one of the worst recessions that we've ever seen. So people will lose their jobs. Job insecurity was already there as it was. In-work poverty was off the scale in a way that we've never seen before, and all of these issues have got to be addressed. So I'll start off very briefly talking about what's happened since I came into the brief, because I arrived at the time of the crisis. And one of the things that I've been working with the National Education Union and Mary, who's been fantastic, and other trade unions, is about safety. Now, there's been a narrative that's developed within the media that's been quite destructive and very worrying, that the trade unions within the education sector have been obstructive and they're trying to stop children from going to school. And that's not the case at all. And we've seen some of the quite nasty media rhetoric that is trying to claim that certain members of certain unions are militant. And as you know, I wouldn't use militant as a word to describe them by any stretch of the imagination. So that has been quite worrying. And certainly what happened at the beginning of the pandemic was that trade unions themselves tried to work with government. They repeatedly asked to be around the table. The Labour Party, myself and other colleagues, called for the creation of a task force, which is what happened in other countries such as Denmark, where the safety principles that needed to be met within schools were agreed by Danish trade unions before the government actually implemented them. Now, that didn't happen here. The unions made reasonable suggestions numerous times. We know about the NEU's 5 tests, and the government failed to meet those tests or to address them in any shape or form, really. And then we reached a point where on the 1st of June, the government wanted to reopen schools or move to a wider reopening. Now, they've been open throughout the pandemic for key worker children, but they wanted to open the schools for reception year 1 and year 6. They wanted to do that for a period of weeks, and then they wanted to open the whole school for a few weeks, a month if possible, before the summer holidays, so that all children were in schools. Now, when they announced their plans 2 weeks before June the 1st, they hadn't produced any scientific advice to reassure people that even they thought that it was safe to do this. We repeatedly pressured them into publishing this scientific advice. And as you know, the SAGE Group published its advice days before schools were due to open, and confirmed that really we were at the foothills of knowledge when it came to understanding how infective children could be, or whether they could act as vectors for transmission within their communities. And that was very worrying. And what the SAGE scientific advice also stated was that test, track and isolate needed to be fully operational before schools moved to a wider reopening. And also that there needed to be a consensus around messaging between the sector, education unions and parents before the government opened schools to provide that reassurance about safety. None of that happened. Then we had independent scientists coming out, the Indendent SAGE Group, saying that schools shouldn't be open until at least the 15th of June. We had Scientists for Labour expressing their concern about opening schools. And we even had the Chief Medical Officer for the Department of Education confirming, when questioned in the House of Commons, that children could act as vectors for transmission. So on June the 1st, when schools did move to a wider reopening, they were essentially left in an unimaginable position. Schools and local authorities were being asked to carry out risk assessments. The guidance that had been produced by government was deficient in many areas. I'm sure Mary's already mentioned that the government changed the advice 41 times or thereabouts before they reached the final set of principles. Unions tried to help. The NEU had an additional risk assessment questionnaire that schools could fill in, which some schools looked at and some didn't. So we're in a situation very much where schools were basically trying to get on with it by themselves. And local authorities were having to make a decision as to whether they thought they could take a gamble with reopening schools, or whether they were taking a no school should open at all approach, as many local authorities did. So on that Sunday night before June the 1st, we were in a position where the government hadn't reassured people about safety. Schools weren't entirely sure what they were supposed to be doing, or whether they were really adopting the right safety principles. And parents and pupils, and indeed teaching staff, were agonising about whether they should go in on that Monday morning. And we should never have been in that position. I was in the debate today, and it was interesting because a Tory MP who used to be a teacher popped up and started trying to make the case for, well, you know, you've got more chance of being hit by a bolt of lightning, so we need to get these schools reopened for all children now. And I was appalled, because it was as if, and this has certainly been the message coming from some quarters of government, that yeah, it is a trade-off between safety and academic attainment, that it's all right if people will be put at risk, provided that we get children through those doors in schools. And it shouldn't be like that. It's not a trade-off between safety and academic and emotional support. We need a system that provides both, and that's where the government has fallen well short of being able to deal with this. So in terms of what needs to happen next, I fully support Mary's 10 points that the NEU set out and the National Plan for Education, because firstly it's about making sure that we have the safety principles in place, and we still need to have a task force right across the sector to produce those principles. But secondly, we also need that task force to develop this National Plan for Education, and that means having adequate resources within schools. It means looking at things such as enhanced pupil premiums. It means making sure that local authorities are funded to provide holiday schemes. It also means that qualified teachers who've left the profession, they're encouraged to come back so that they can provide additional support, so you can actually have more children in schools. And at the same time, looking at other public buildings that could be used as school spaces so you can have smaller class sizes, things that the government has not been looking at all, but other countries have been doing very, very well. And then beyond that, it's also about not really using the term catch up, because it's been annoying me when people keep saying, oh, children need to catch up, they need to catch up. And it's right that we should assume that children have fallen behind at home because many won't have received the support that they need. Many won't have even had access to a digital device. And they will be in a situation where the attainment gap is exacerbated even more than it already is. But to expect pupils to go back in September, those particularly who are doing their GCSEs and A-levels, and to catch up on all of the work that they've lost, as well as starting a new set of modules for GCSE and A-level, it just seems preposterous to think that that can be achieved without pupils falling even further behind and without putting huge amounts of pressure and stress on the workforce. So there needs to be a discussion with Ofqual and the exam boards about the ways that GCSE and A-level exams can be streamlined. And I appreciate it's difficult because different exam boards do it in different ways. Different schools teach different modules at different times, but it's not insurmountable. And beyond that, the government also needs to look at ways to look at teacher assessment. I mean, it's been used in this pandemic to provide grades for A-levels and GCSE. And of course, it's not perfect. And of course, the arguments about bias are completely valid and they need to be addressed. But in the event that we see a second spike, which many scientists are suggesting is a likelihood, we need to be in a position where we can go back into lockdown and those pupils won't be impeded and they won't have their further exams affected by this. That's why we've got to look at this flexible framework, and it is something that we can look at carrying on in the future as well, because I've always been sceptical of an exam system that concentrates on what we call rote learning, where you've got to remember things at the end of 2 years, and if you have a bad day, that's your life down the toilet, no matter how capable you are. Whereas all year you might have been a grade A student and doing fantastically. So there has to be a mixed approach to this that can address the talents that our young people and children have. I think Mary has probably already talked about blended learning, the need to make sure that we've got an approach that would suit learning at home and learning in school. And a key part of that, as well as having a curriculum that suits that, is providing digital devices. Now, the government used one of the arguments to get children back into the classroom was the attainment gap and how disadvantaged children were going to be in an even worse position. Yet they did nothing to make sure that those 1 million children who don't have access to a digital device have one to learn from home on. Now, they promised it for year 10s and some disadvantaged pupils, but in many cases, those laptops haven't arrived where they're required. And that doesn't even touch the sides of the 1 million children overall that will need that. So we need to see commitments from government for that digital provision. And that's not just for this pandemic, that's overall to make sure that our pupils can learn in the way that they need to. And then finally, to touch on some of the points that both Mary and Susan, I think, have covered. And that's about the emotional aspect of all of this. There was one line in the government's initial guidance that related to mental health. And it said, oh, teachers should assess pupils to see whether they've been adversely affected by the pandemic and what assistance they might need. But it didn't go into any detail about what extra resources they'd be provided, what assistance they might be able to give those pupils. So again, you know, our workforce within schools was asked to act as social workers and psychologists all rolled into one. And that's not good enough, because even children who were in homes that weren't in a terrible situation, they didn't suffer a bereavement, they weren't in cramped, difficult conditions, they will have been watching the news every day and seeing the number of deaths coming up on the screen, and that will have had a profound psychological effect on them. They will have questioned their own safety when they've gone into school, when they've seen all of the news reports about spikes in the R rate in particular regions, and that's going to concern many children, even if they don't outwardly, you know, express that to their parents. It'll be in the back of their mind, and all of that needs to be addressed. And that's why it's so important to have that national plan for emotional and mental health sitting alongside the national education plan, to make sure that we provide that bedrock to pupils, because they can only learn when they feel secure and they feel happy enough to learn. And it might take a while to bring them back to any form of normality. So that's crucial, really. And then to kind of end my rant, in terms of where we go next. So we've had 2 U-turns in the last 2 weeks, as I've said. We've had one on free school meals. We also had one last week where the government admitted that when they said they wanted to open schools completely before the summer holidays, and everybody told them that this was crazy and it wasn't feasible, that there wasn't space and there wasn't enough teaching staff or teaching assistants, they still ploughed on with it until eventually last week they realised actually, yeah, it's not really going to work, is it? We might have to roll back from this. So 2 U-turns in the last 2 weeks. And what I want to see coming out of this is that if we can try and harness a public campaign in the way that we've done with free school meals around eliminating child poverty, and understanding that really at the heart of all of this, it's not just about building an education system that realises children's aspirations, but it's making sure that we eliminate child poverty completely so that they can realise their aspirations. And that means looking at universal credit and the 5-week wait. That means getting rid of the 2-child limit in relation to child benefits. That means making sure that in every single workplace, workers feel secure. They don't feel frightened about losing their jobs because they're on 0-hour contracts. It means that they're earning enough to live on and not a poverty wage, as we've seen in recent years. And this ties in quite a lot to the wonderful work that the IER have been doing, and why it's so important to make sure that we tie in the manifesto for labour law into everything that we're doing. And although people might not think that it relates in any way, shape or form to education, it does, because the children of today are the adults of tomorrow. Unless we can provide them with the security that they need to realise their dreams, they're not going to have a future, and neither are we. That's it from me. That was a bit of a stream of consciousness.
Excellent. It was excellent as ever, Rebecca. You never rant. So thank you very much. And you'll see that reflected in the chat box, where you obviously have some very real fans. They recognise your willingness and your keenness to work with trade unions throughout all of this. And they say that you've hit the ground running at a very difficult time in your new position. So well done to you. Now we are running out of time, but I thought I'd pick out maybe one or two questions to put to people. So there is a question from Carol Redfern, and I'll put this to Mary. And she says, will the free meals over summer apply to learners in post-16 colleges? Now, I know the decision is just today and you might not know the details. So that was to you. Shall I just put them all before I... And then maybe one to Sue. Nick Giorgio says, how does the transmission rate differ from 2 to 1 metre in social distancing? A last one. There are those who suggest that schools shouldn't open, schools should open so that women do not find themselves permanently out of work, stuck at home looking after kids. How would you respond to that? So, Mary, over to you first.
So, if you get a free school meal, I think it's anywhere up to 18. So yes, it should apply. That should still apply. And we absolutely know that schools are really important, not just for education, but for socialisation, and so that parents can work. And that's why our plan for September has to incorporate blended learning, but also has to incorporate learning on new school sites, bringing back more teachers. Part of this is it is about the importance of education. It's also about the importance of schools for society. Schools do enable parents to work and get back to work, and that's important. So an investment in schools in terms of more buildings, more teachers, so we can have schools opening safely, is an investment for the future. It's an economic investment. It's as important for the country as the Jobs Recovery Plan was. You know, we think it's an absolutely sensible investment to make.
And so do we. Sue?
Yeah, so laws of physics means that droplets are likely to travel 4 to 10 times and reach somebody else if it's a metre compared to 2 metres. So it's a much more risky situation to be in. You put on top of that human behaviour. If you say to people 2 metres, they'll interpret that roughly as a metre or metre and a bit. If you then say a metre, you're down to a couple of feet, you've lost social distancing completely, because you know that's just the sort of distance that people have round about. It's not just about people walking around in the community that this is about. It's about how are employers going to use this. if they begin using 1 metre, A, it's going to be much more risky for people, and B, it's not just people sitting at desks or sitting at restaurant tables or whatever, it's people getting up and moving around, going to kitchens, going to toilets and all of that. So bringing it from 2 metres to 1 metre is not a scientific decision, it's a political and economic decision, which is why I think the Downing Street has set up its own review of scientists and economists to pronounce on it, and they've circumvented SAGE in this situation.
Yes, if they don't like the question, if they don't like the answer, they ask the question somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yes. And Rebecca, any last points?
No, just to kind of say about risk assessments really, because certainly I'm no expert when it comes to health and safety and public health. But what I have noticed, particularly with schools, and I'm sure with a lot of workplaces, is that we've been left out at sea. The guidance has been so ambiguous that it's difficult to enforce because we don't really know what we're trying to enforce. And then you add to that the fact that the health and safety executive has been decimated over the last 10 years. So even if you could enforce it, there'd be nobody to go out and inspect. And certainly with schools, what they did in Denmark and other places, I understand, was that they had a quality assurance system. So a local official would look at the school's risk assessment to double check it and just check that it was okay. Well, that's not happening in many areas. Some councils are stepping in and having a look at it and giving their own unofficial quality assurance. But in most places, that isn't happening at all. So in the event of legal action, God forbid that something happened to a pupil or member of staff, it would be very, very difficult to take forward any cases. And I'm sure in the months and years to come, we'll have a very legal discussion on all of this and where the liability lies in the event that something terrible should happen, and please God it doesn't.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've reached our time, so it's just for me to say thank you to our 3 brilliant speakers. Wonderful to see you all. Thank you to our audience for all your comments and questions put in chat box. Sorry we couldn't get to more. The hour always goes so quickly, but there should be a final slide coming up at the end of this event, which will let you log into the Institute's website, where you'll find a lot more information on legal issues, health and safety issues, all our campaigns. Please stay in touch, get involved, and join us again at another event. So thank you for listening.